So, the first thing I want to talk about, I figure I'll start with the more mundane stuff, and then I will go into the, like, bigger headline news, if that's all right with you guys, or you guy, one person watching, you know? So, the first thing is the rent control study. Yesterday, I continued on my journey to read studies about things that I care about. This time, the issue was rent control. For those of you not familiar, rent control is basically what it sounds like. The government uses some of its policymaking power to tell, landlords or, be they individual or corporate, that you can't raise rent on this property, these apartments, above a certain point, right? And the purpose behind this is to sort of try to make housing more affordable for average people, people who don't have an especially easy time affording a place to live. So this study looked at a few cities in America where rent control happens, because there are some cities that have rent controlled housing in America, believe it or not, for how high rents are. New York is one of them. There are some areas of New York that are rent controlled housing. And then I think there's LA, there's Boston. There's not that many, ultimately, because one of the biggest things that prevents the acquisition of more data on the subject. There is data to speak of, but one of the things that stops there from being more is that most states and cities in the United States have laws on the books that say it is illegal to do rent control and it is illegal to build public housing. So by law, the government is not allowed to say, okay, we want to build housing that won't bankrupt you, because market, I guess. But looking at this study, it found that, well, I mean, it's kind of a isn't so much a finding as it is a given in like rent control, but rent control does in fact make housing cheaper for people who are in the rent controlled apartments. It's been known to happen, but it has actually mixed effects on other housing, funnily enough. There are some instances, like in New York, where the presence of rent-controlled housing actually drives down the price of nearby housing, which is good. But there's also instances in places like Massachusetts and in Boston where the opposite can happen, where the presence of rent-controlled housing can drive up the price of neighboring housing units. But what's common to both of those is that the price being affected by the rent control in that way, in a sort of downstream way, is not the rent controlled apartments themselves. I know it's like very obvious and straightforward to say, but rent controlling an apartment building makes the apartments in that building cheaper. That's sort of tautological. And at the end of the day, that's what a lot of people like myself care about, is that housing is affordable and won't like bankrupt you. I think that's important. The article didn't really say that much outside of like analyzing the policy implications for doing rent control as far as like other apartments, non-rent controlled apartments are concerned. But I think what I'm keeping in mind here is that I don't care about the markets, right? I don't care if landlords want to make a profit, because at the end of the day, landlords are a non-essential job. They're a non-essential sector. Anything that a landlord can do is like not essential to them. If that makes sense. What I mean by that is like sometimes the landlord will be the guy that calls the heating company or the guy that calls the plumbing company if something goes wrong with the utilities in the apartment, but the landlord doesn't have any role in actually fixing the apartment. All they do is call the heating guy or the plumbing guy, and sometimes they don't even do that. In fact, there's a problem where landlords will abstain from calling the services to fix their apartments when those services are very obviously needed. So what my policy prescription here is that all housing becomes either rent controlled or owned by a housing cooperative outside of luxury housing. Luxury housing, that's fine. You want to play around with the market with that, big giant mansions and whatever, fine. I don't think anybody would be too upset about that. But in any reasonable housing arrangement that isn't considered like glamorous, we need to detach that from the sort of investment vehicle that housing has become. Because if you don't have a roof over your head, a lot of bad shit happens, including but not limited to death from exposure. Because to go back to the problem of landlords like not calling the utility company, the reason that it in that instance has to be the landlord calling the utility company is because they own the building. If the building is owned by a housing cooperative, then the cooperative can just delegate the responsibility to say, like, okay, whoever sees the problem, please call the guy, or, tell somebody about it. Somebody will be obligated to call them and then just, like, let the rest of the co-op know that you've called them so that we don't get any, like, excessive double calls and all that. Because everybody would be, in that scenario, part owner of this apartment. So with that in mind, all housing, I think, should be either rent-controlled or owned by a housing cooperative, and only the, like, luxury housing should be considered as, like, an investment vehicle or, like a market commodity. I think that's actually a pretty reasonable policy prescription to have for maybe not the immediate future, but certainly a pretty near future in terms of, like, history. Like 10-ish, 15-ish years down the line. That wouldn't be an infeasible change to advocate for. And as far as where the line is drawn, this is actually one thing that I think would merit thinking about. As far as where would you draw the line between what is or isn't luxury housing, that's kind of a hard line to draw. I will absolutely grant that. But I think there is a sort of logic that even the Supreme Court has used from time to time, that the sort of it when you see it. If you see something and you can clearly tell, like, okay, that's excessive, then, I'm comfortable saying that that's luxury housing. But if you see a house that's like, man, this is kind of big, but I don't know if it's excessive, then maybe that could be designated as housing for a larger family or for two families, even. Something like that. But at the end of the day, my end objective here is just to advocate for a position where, like, housing is free or, like, inexpensive enough to the point that it's not a problem of people not being able to get a house. I think that'd be a good problem to avoid, is like, I need a house and I can't afford one. Nobody should be experiencing that problem. If we are designing human society to be like, hey, we should all, like, coalesce and live in a social arrangement where we're not dying outside in the cold because we have the ability to build buildings. I think we should prioritize that first and foremost. Anything dealing with money comes second. And, fuck the landlords. Like, I'm perfectly comfortable hanging them out to dry. Because in this economic system, if you just, I don't know, repo all their possessions without, all their, like, real estate possessions, housing without compensation, then, the housing would be rent controlled, so they'd be able to afford it with ideally a relatively entry-level job, or even if housing is free, they could just have a house. So even if they don't have a job, they would have a place to go to sleep, and they wouldn't be in danger of, like, experiencing horrifying conditions of exposure in the outside world. So yeah, free housing is good, actually. I'll put that one up there with my free food video.